Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to help you make sense of the world's, well, most complex events by extracting the key knowledge you need.
And today we're tackling something huge, a sequence of events in September 2025 that really felt like a geopolitical earthquake.
It completely rewired security thinking in the Middle East. Happened incredibly fast, too, just about 10 days, really.
We're focusing on two massive things that happened back to back. First, this wave of Israeli cross-border strikes that didn't just hit neighboring areas but went deep, culminating in a strike inside Doha, Qatar.
And then, almost immediately, the response. This very sudden, very public Saudi-Pakistan Mutual Defense Pact.
And not just any pact. It came with this explicit nuclear dimension, a really unmistakable signal.
Yeah, our sources make it clear this wasn't just, another tactical move. It felt like a fundamental shift in how deterrence is viewed across the Gulf.
Exactly. So our mission today is to get past the headlines, dig into the history, the psychology, the strategy, really understand what this realignment means.
Right. The core question we need to unpack is this. How did one tactical military event, that specific strike in Doha, trigger such a massive strategic reaction, this Saudi-Pakistan pact?
And crucially, what does this whole sequence tell us about stability in the Gulf moving forward? And maybe even bigger, what does it mean for the rules of global security?
Okay, let's dive in. This is a big one.
So to really get why a strike in Doha, this wealthy Gulf capital, a diplomatic hub, why that specific event caused such a domino effect leading to a nuclear-tinged pact.
Yeah, you have to see it wasn't out of the blue, right?
Not at all. It's the endpoint of decades, really, of boundaries just unraveling. This isn't a sudden crisis. It's built on layers and layers of history.
Okay, so frame that history source. What are the key layers we need to understand?
Well, you've got these overlapping historical tectonic plates, you could say. Start with the Ottoman Empire collapsing. That led to colonial powers carving up the region, drawing lines on maps.
Lines that didn't always make sense on the ground and still cause friction today.
Exactly. Then layered on top, you had this surge of secular Arab nationalism. Powerful for a while, but ultimately didn't unify the region. And then the huge one, 1948, the creation of Israel. That set the stage for so many of the conflicts we still see.
But for the dynamics we're talking about now, particularly the Sunni-Shia rivalry, the Gulf versus Iran wasn't 1979 the real turning point, the Iranian Revolution.
Absolutely. 1979 changed everything. It wasn't just about Iran getting a new government. It was an ideological shift for the whole region. The competition wasn't just about nationalism anymore. It became about revolutionary Islamism.
And critically, Iran started using a new strategy after that, didn't they?
Yes. Crucially, post-79, Tehran began building this network. Really sophisticated. Proxies across the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon, various groups in Iraq, later the Houthis in Yemen.
So they could project power without direct military confrontation, an asymmetric approach.
Precisely. It allowed them to challenge Israel, challenge the Gulf monarchies all across borders. It created this whole new axis of tension. It was, well, a game changer.
Okay, so summarizing the key turning points. 1948 to 73, you have the big Arab-Israeli wars. That established the main rivalries and also led to the rise of militant groups when conventional armies couldn't deliver.
Right. And then post-79, those non-state actors, the proxies, become central tools of geopolitics.
And that brings us closer to the present day. The 2010s, 2020s, we saw a reaction to that Iranian strategy, didn't we? From the Gulf states.
Yeah, definitely. The Gulf states, mostly driven by this shared fear of Iran and its network, started making their own pragmatic security moves, realignments.
The most public example being the Abraham Accords in 2020.
That's it. The Accords were fascinating because they showed certain Gulf elites, UAE, Bahrain initially, were willing to normalize relations, even cooperate on security with Israel. Why? Because they saw Iran as the bigger shared threat.
Even though, as we know, public opinion in those countries remains strongly against Israeli policies.
That's the critical tension. The elite versus public split. The rulers were pursuing quiet cooperation, economic ties, hoping to kind of insulate their wealthy cities from the region's turmoil.
But that delicate balance act, it seems the intensifying Gaza conflict from 2023 to 2025 just shattered it.
Completely shattered it. Even though the fighting wasn't in the Gulf, its intensity basically normalized, crossing previous red lines.
How so?
We saw Israeli strikes hitting Syria, hitting Lebanon much more frequently. It became this pattern, treating these sovereign neighbors almost like extensions of the conflict zone.
So the Gulf states who had made this quiet peace suddenly saw that the idea of inviolable borders might not apply everywhere, maybe not even to them.
Exactly. The rules seem to be changing. And that steady erosion of boundaries, that pattern of escalation, created the tense atmosphere, the context, where something like the Doha strike could even be considered, let alone carried out.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the shock itself. September 2025. The reports we looked at described a pattern of operations that was, frankly, geographically audacious.
Yeah, it wasn't just the usual places. The reporting showed this quick burst, a concentrated wave of strikes hitting multiple separate sovereign countries in just a few days.
Where are we talking about?
Targets mentioned were across Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, but also Tunisia, Yemen, and crucially Qatar. It was a clear message. Operations weren't contained anymore. They were regional, extending way beyond the traditional conflict zones.
And that must have set off alarm bells everywhere.
Deeply alarming for every capital in the region. But, as you said, the absolute peak, the moment everything changed, was that strike in Doha, around September 9th or 10th, 2025.
What exactly happened, and why was this strike different? Why did it hit so much harder, politically speaking, than, say, another strike in Syria?
Well, the reports indicated it targeted senior Hamas figures. They were being hosted in Qatar, and there were injuries, possibly deaths. But why it was a watershed moment? Well, several reasons. First, Qatar itself. Right, Doha, a Gulf capital. Always seen as kind of protected, by its wealth, its role as a key U.S. ally hosting a major base, its diplomatic neutrality. It was supposed to be a safe space.
So if the Gulf saw itself as this insulated zone, prosperous and separate from the chaos, this strike just blew that idea apart.
Precisely. Shattered that perception of immunity. But there's a second reason, just as provocative, Qatar's diplomatic role.
The mediator role.
Exactly. Qatar spent years building itself up as the go-between. The place for Gaza ceasefire talks, hostage negotiations, quiet diplomacy. They were the indispensable interlocutor.
So striking guests involved in those talks in Doha.
It fundamentally changed a space meant for fragile negotiation into just another part of the conflict zone. It broke this really important unwritten rule. You don't target the diplomatic space, you respect the host. That was a taboo for the Gulf states.
The diplomatic infrastructure itself became vulnerable. I could see how that would send shockwaves.
Immediate, powerful shockwaves across the entire Gulf. The sources show it wasn't just anger, it was fear. Acute fear.
The thinking being, if Doha, the mediator, the U.S. ally, the rich, stable capital, if Doha can be hit like this, with impunity...
Then who's next? Is Riyadh safe?
Right.
Abu Dhabi? Kuwait City? No one felt truly insulated anymore. That sudden realization of vulnerability, that's what drove everything that happened next, forced a total rethink of security.
Right, that fear, that sudden gut punch feeling of vulnerability, that seems to be the direct line to the massive realignment we saw just days later. The question for Gulf leaders must have shifted overnight.
Absolutely. It went from how do we help mediate this to, wait, how do we defend ourselves if our usual security partners like the U.S. can't or won't stop this kind of thing?
And that question leads straight to the Saudi-Pakistan Mutual Defense Pact, announced around September 18th, 19th, barely a week after the Doha strike.
And this wasn't just some routine update to an existing agreement. This was fast, dramatic, a really aggressive pivot by Riyadh towards building its own deterrence fast.
Okay, tell us about the pact itself. What did it actually say? And then the part that really shook things up.
Well, the core text is pretty standard for a mutual defense pact. It declares collective security, and attack on one is an attack on both. Simple enough.
But
the context and what came immediately after amplified it massively. Pakistani officials went public right away. And they stated very clearly that Pakistan's nuclear program, its capabilities, its potential umbrella, could be made available to Saudi Arabia. Under certain conditions, of course.
Wow. Okay, that's huge. Putting the nuclear option on the table in a bilateral pact in that region, that's not just signing a paper, that's signaling a major shift in the power balance.
More than a shift. It's a very loud, very direct signal. Everyone immediately understood it was aimed squarely at anyone thinking about violating Gulf sovereignty again, especially Israel. It was Saudi Arabia finding the quickest way possible to get some form of nuclear backing, dramatically raising the potential cost of any future aggression against the kingdom.
But hang on. Some analysts we read dismissed this, called it diplomatic theater. They pointed out how incredibly difficult, maybe impossible it would be to actually share nuclear weapons or capability. So why should we take this signal seriously as a deterrent? Isn't it just talk?
That's a really important question. And you're right, the difference between signaling and operational reality is key here. But what gives this particular signal so much weight, what makes it more than just theater, is the history between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. It's deep and parts of it aren't widely known.
You mean the past cooperation, the covert stuff?
Exactly. The sources confirm they have long-standing military and financial ties. And crucially, this history includes significant Saudi financial backing during the really critical development phases of Pakistan's own nuclear program years ago.
Ah, okay, so there's a history of cooperation on this sensitive issue.
Precisely. So when Pakistani officials make this public statement now, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's grounded in decades of shared, often secret history. That gives it credibility.
So even if actually handing over warheads or setting up launch codes is a logistical nightmare, and we can talk more about that, the public statement, backed by that hidden history, creates an immediate, believable political deterrent.
That's the strategic genius, if you want to call it that. Leveraging history for instant deterrence effect. It was Riyadh's immediate, very strong answer to the shock and, frankly, the perceived humiliation of the Doha strike. It showed they were willing to explore extreme options to ensure their security wasn't solely dependent on external powers, whose commitment now seemed, well, questionable.
We've covered the strategic chess moves, but what about the people? For millions living in places like Doha, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, places that felt safe, this must have had a huge psychological impact. What does that kind of ambient threat do to individuals?
It fundamentally breaks what some call the psychological contract of security. People in the Gulf, for years, had this sort of unspoken deal. Okay, maybe less political freedom, but in return, the rulers guarantee stability, prosperity, safety from the region's chaos.
And the Doha strike ripped that up.
Exactly. When a strike hits a capital like that, it introduces this chronic background level of anxiety, hypervigilance. You look at studies from long-term conflict zones, it leads to collective trauma, high stress levels, the feeling that nowhere is truly safe anymore. The walls around their supposedly secure world were breached.
And then on the bigger scale, for societies, these events seem to fuel polarization, right? Hardening identities on all sides.
Oh, absolutely. It acts like an accelerant. How these strikes are framed is everything. The exact same event gets interpreted completely differently depending on where you sit.
So in Israel, it might be framed domestically as necessary counterterrorism, essential for security.
Right. Decisive action. But in Arab publics, it's seen almost universally as aggression, a violation, a humiliation, an attack on dignity. And this deepens the divides, pushes people who might have been moderate towards more extreme positions. It hardens those us versus them identities.
And this sounds exactly like that classic international relations concept, the security dilemma. How does the Doha strike fit that model?
It's almost a textbook case. The security dilemma, is when one state takes actions to increase its own security defensive measures. In their view, but those actions are seen by another state as threatening, as offensive.
Which then makes the second state react defensively, which the first state sees as offensive, and it spirals.
Precisely. So Israel sees the strike as a defensive security measure, but Saudi Arabia perceives it as a deeply offensive act, an existential threat. Their response, the pact with Pakistan, with its nuclear element, is their defensive measure. But you can bet Iran and others now see that as an offensive escalation.
So everyone ends up less secure.
Exactly. It triggers this spiral of mistrust, arms buildups. The Doha strike, arguably intended to enhance tactical security, ended up creating massive strategic insecurity for the whole region.
And for the Gulf rulers themselves, this isn't just about military threats, it's about their own legitimacy, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. Their core promise, the bedrock of their rule, is stability and security. When your sovereign territory gets violated like that, it directly challenges your ability to deliver on that promise. The pressure becomes immense.
Which forces them to react strongly, visibly.
Yes, they have to be seen taking decisive action. The speed and the very public nature of the Saudi-Pakistan Pact wasn't just about deterring Israel, it was also about reassuring their own population, sending a message. We hear you, we feel the insult, and we are taking strong steps to protect national dignity and security. Failing to act decisively could risk domestic stability. #B, cultural variations and perception divides.
Okay, let's talk about how differently this was all perceived. Depending on where you stood, the narrative was completely different. Start with the Gulf public's people in Qatar, Saudi Arabia. How did the strike hit culturally?
Well, there's an extreme sensitivity to sovereignty violations in the Gulf. It's tied up with national dignity, pride, the idea of your capital city being struck. It's a profound psychological blow. And here, that elite versus public split we talked about becomes really, really important.
Remind us of that split again.
The ruling elites might be pursuing quiet deals, pragmatic security arrangements like the Abraham Accords, often based on shared economic or anti-Iran interests, but they're publics. overwhelmingly, deeply pro-Palestinian, often quite militantly so.
So when Doha gets hit, those elites suddenly find their quiet pragmatism impossible to maintain.
Exactly. They lose all room to maneuver privately, the public outcry, the media pressure, it becomes overwhelming. They're forced, almost overnight, to adopt a much harder, more confrontational public stance, even if it goes against their quieter, long-term strategic calculations.
Did we see concrete examples of that, backtracking on normalization?
Yes. The sources mentioned that immediately after the strike, some of the Gulf states that had normalized ties had to quickly pause or pull back on specific initiatives, trade deals, planned cultural exchanges, tech ventures. The public mood just made continuing with business as usual politically toxic. The violation of sovereignty forced them back towards presenting a more unified hardline Arab front.
Okay, flip side. How did Iran and its allies, the Axis of Resistance, spin this?
For Tehran and its network, these strikes are, frankly, useful propaganda. Domestically and regionally, they frame it as definitive proof of aggressive, expansionist policies by their enemies.
So it justifies their own actions.
Precisely. It becomes Exhibit A in their argument that their own regional network building, their support for proxies, their escalatory actions are all purely defensive. Necessary responses to existential threats. It fuels their core narrative.
Meanwhile, in the West, public opinion is always fragmented on these issues. What were the main competing viewpoints we saw in Western media and discourse?
Typically divided. On one side, you have a focus on the counterterrorism angle, Israel's security perspective, the need to dismantle hostile networks, often citing historical context, legitimate security concerns.
And the other side?
The other side emphasizes international law, sovereignty, the humanitarian impact on Palestinians, and sees these kinds of extraterritorial strikes, especially in third-party countries, as dangerous precedents, violations of international norms. And these divides run deep, often along political or generational lines in the US and Europe.
And the media just amplifies all this.
Massively. You have these siloed information ecosystems. Western mainstream news might focus more on the geopolitics, the diplomacy, the legal arguments, the impact on US policy.
Whereas Arab media
almost entirely focuses on the violation of sovereignty, the breach of dignity, the human cost. And then social media just pours gasoline on the fire, viral images, visceral footage. It creates instant emotional reaction, huge political pressure on leaders across the region to respond immediately and visibly.
Okay, let's shift to the lasting consequences. This whole episode really tested the diplomatic flexibility we'd seen developing, particularly with the Abraham Accords. How did the Doha strike impact the future of normalization?
It put up a huge roadblock, maybe an insurmountable one, at least for a while. Those Gulf states that normalized did so partly on the idea that partnership with Israel would enhance their security, their stability.
And this event suggested the opposite.
Exactly. When military action directly hits Gulf sovereignty, it completely validates the arguments of the anti-normalization crowds domestically. It makes the position of the ruling elites who pushed for normalization incredibly difficult. They're forced to pivot back to that harder line, exemplified by the Saudi-Pakistan Pact. It makes any further normalization, especially bringing Saudi Arabia fully on board, exponentially harder, maybe impossible in the near term.
And beyond regional politics, this ignited a really fierce debate about international norms, didn't it? Specifically sovereignty and targeted killings abroad.
Yes, this cuts right to the heart of international law. Legal experts immediately started debating the clash between two core UN Charter principles.
Which are?
Article 2.4, which basically says you can't use force against another state's territory or independence. And Article 51, the inherent right to self-defense if you're attacked.
So the state doing the strike invokes Article 51 self-defense, maybe against an imminent threat. But the state that's hit, Qatar in this case, and others, point to Article 2.4, you violated our sovereignty.
That's the fundamental tension. And when these extraterritorial strikes, these targeted killings outside declared war zones, start to become routine, what some call the normalization of extraterritorial strikes, it's incredibly dangerous for the whole system.
Why dangerous?
Because it risks eroding the very foundation of international law, the idea of sovereign borders. It potentially gives powerful states a green light to act unilaterally inside weaker states whenever they claim a threat, undermining the protections the UN Charter was supposed to provide. It makes smaller states feel incredibly vulnerable.
Which connects directly to the next point. The crisis of credibility for external security guarantees, particularly the U.S. guarantee.
Yes, the interpretation in some Gulf capitals was blunt. The Doha strike happened, and our primary security partner, the U.S., didn't prevent it. Whether that's fair or not, the perception was a failure of deterrence.
So if you can't rely on your longtime ally to deter this kind of violation, even in a region vital to global energy,
Then relying solely on those external guarantees looks strategically unsound. You need to hedge. You need your own options. The sources confirm this triggered immediate debate about the reliability of U.S. commitments. And this forced hedging, like the Saudis' rush towards the Pakistan Pact, ultimately weakens the influence and mediation capacity of those external powers in the long run. #B, controversies and critical analysis.
let's dig into the controversies surrounding these events a bit more. First, the legality claim. What's the main criticism of using self-defense or imminent threat to justify hitting a target deep inside a non-belligerent country like Qatar?
The core legal challenge revolves around the definition of imminent threat and the principle of proportionality and necessity. Yes, states have a right to self-defense, but striking deep inside a sovereign third country, especially one that hosts diplomatic channels and isn't actively participating in hostilities.
It stretches the definition.
Many legal scholars argue it stretches imminent threat too far. They argue the burden of proof has to be exceptionally high to justify breaching the sovereignty of a state like Qatar in that way. Was the threat so immediate, so severe, that there was absolutely no other way to mitigate it without violating Qatari territory? Many argue that high bar wasn't clearly met, and it sets a dangerous precedent that weakens sovereignty for everyone.
Okay, now the biggest controversy, the nuclear signaling in the Saudi-Pakistan Pact. You touched on this, but let's be clear. Was this just symbolic, or is there a real chance of it becoming operational? Sharing nuclear capability.
This is really the crux of the strategic debate, and it operates on two levels. Level one, the public statement itself. Saying Pakistan's nuclear program could be made available, that's pure political signaling. And as we discussed, given their history, it's highly effective signaling. It instantly boosts Saudi Arabia's perceived deterrence.
But level two is the operational reality.
Exactly. And actually operationalizing that, making nuclear deterrence truly shared, that's incredibly complex, astronomically complex and risky.
What makes it so hard, beyond just moving materials, which is obviously difficult?
It's about command and control.
Yeah.
C2, who decides to use the weapon? When? How? You need absolutely watertight, unified, secure protocols. You need immense political trust. Personnel integration. Think about NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. They involve things like dual key systems, where both the host nation and the U.S. have to agree.
Achieving that level of integration between Riyadh and Islamabad seems unlikely.
It would be extraordinarily difficult, politically, technically, ideologically, and the international backlash would be massive. Sanctions, UN Security Council crisis. It's hard to imagine it becoming truly operational in the sense of shared launch authority without triggering a global crisis.
So to reiterate, the political impact of the statement is huge, creating immediate deterrence through ambiguity and perceived commitment, even if the practicalities of actually sharing weapons are almost prohibitive in the short to medium term.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. The threat value comes from the public commitment and the underlying history, changing the psychological calculus for potential adversaries immediately, regardless of the operational hurdles.
This whole sequence seems to have pushed the region across some dangerous new thresholds. What are the critical ones we need to watch going forward?
I'd highlight two. First, as we discussed, the continued normalization of these extraterritorial strikes. If hitting targets in third-party capitals becomes just another tool in the toolbox, international law loses its meaning and conflicts will inevitably spread and escalate. That's maximum instability.
And the second.
The potential abuse of nuclear ambiguity. The Saudi-Pakistan Pact involves very public, politically charged rhetoric about nuclear capabilities being available. While maybe not operational now, this kind of talk can be destabilizing in itself.
How so?
It could provoke rivals, like Iran, to accelerate their own programs or pursue nuclear weapons definitively. It could push other regional powers, maybe Turkey, to reconsider their own stances. It risks turning ambiguous signaling into a catalyst for a real, dangerous arms race and proliferation. #C, expert perspectives and future implications.
Given all this instability and risk, what's the general consensus among analysts, think tanks looking at this shakeup?
Well, the mainstream view across the board is one of alarm. The Doha strike is widely seen as a reckless escalation, something that fundamentally forced Gulf states to reconsider everything about their security.
Regardless of political leaning.
Largely, yes. Analysts warn about the high risk of spillover, the way it eroded those already fragile boundaries, the damage to regional trust. The consensus is pretty clear. The region felt significantly less secure after these events than before.
What about the military perspective? Do these kinds of precision strikes against specific individuals actually work in degrading enemy capabilities?
That's an older debate, and the views are still mixed. Some military and intelligence analysts will argue, yes, taking out key leadership or planners does disrupt operations, it degrades networks, it buys you time, tactical gains.
But the counter-argument.
A lot of counterterrorism research and historical experience suggests that these decapitation strikes often don't destroy the organization. Instead, they can cause it to decentralize, become harder to track, and often provoke unpredictable, sometimes more violent, retaliation. So the tactical gains might be short-lived or offset by strategic blowback.
Especially when it involves violating the sovereignty of a mediating state like Qatar.
Exactly. The political and diplomatic costs in that scenario are universally seen as enormous, regardless of any perceived military benefit.
So amidst all this risk and concern, did the sources suggest any potential positive outcome? You mentioned a critical opportunity earlier.
Well, the opportunity lies in the sheer scale of the shock. Sometimes it takes a crisis of this magnitude to break complacency. It could potentially push major global powers and the regional states themselves to finally get serious about addressing the root causes of conflict, not just managing the symptoms. Real, durable diplomacy.
And for the Gulf states themselves.
For them, the shock creates an urgent incentive to diversify their security partnerships, maybe cooperate more closely with each other, build more genuinely autonomous defense capabilities to hedge their bets, basically. It could, paradoxically, foster a move towards greater regional self-reliance, reducing dependence on external powers whose priorities might shift. That's the potential opportunity born from crisis.
So reflecting on everything we've discussed, this intense sequence, the Doha strike, violating a capital, triggering this dramatic Saudi-Pakistan pact with its nuclear undertones, it really just starkly demonstrates how powerful symbolic actions can be in reshaping geopolitics almost overnight.
Yeah, and it exposed just how fragile those unspoken rules, those tacit boundaries holding the Middle East together actually were. They could be shattered in a matter of days.
I think the key takeaway for you, our listeners, that in this environment, tactical military actions aren't isolated anymore. They can have immediate, profound structural consequences.
Absolutely. A single strike forced states to completely reassess alliances, deterrence strategies, even the promises they make to their own people. It's a fundamental shift in the risk calculus, and frankly, a deeply dangerous one.
And as always, digging this deep leaves us with more questions than answers. Big questions that will shape the region for years. Let's leave you with 4 key ones to think about and keep an eye on.
Okay, first, will we see the Gulf states actually coordinate more effectively among themselves, building truly independent, collective deterrence capabilities to reduce that reliance on outside powers like the U.S., whose guarantees now seem less certain?
Second, how will public opinion factor in? We talked about the elite public split. Will that popular anger and demand for dignity push leaders towards more confrontation? Or will the underlying desire for stability eventually pull them back towards de-escalation? Which force wins out?
Third, a big one for international law. Will the global community find ways to push back against this normalization of extraterritorial strikes? Or will these norms of sovereignty just keep eroding under the pressure of claimed security threats, leaving smaller nations more and more exposed?
And finally, maybe the most chilling question.
Yeah.
Will this nuclear rhetoric, this ambiguity from the Saudi-Pakistan Pact actually lead to real proliferation? Could this political signal ignite a dangerous nuclear arms race involving Iran, maybe others, defining Middle Eastern security for the next generation?
Those are the critical thresholds, the questions we all need to be watching very closely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.